The story of the gifted child rarely begins with pressure or burnout. It almost always begins, quite the opposite actually, with ease. Early on, something becomes clear to the adults around them. This child learns faster. They grasp concepts intuitively. They only need to be given the dots and they figure out how to connect them. While other children struggle through repetition, confusion, and trial and error, the gifted child often understands things the first time they encounter them. And because school rewards outcomes rather than the process, this difference is immediately reinforced. The child gets good grades without studying. They finish assignments faster than everyone else. Teachers praise them, not for persistence or discipline, but for their innate intelligence. Parents describe them as naturally smart. Peers notice the difference. Slowly, subtly, intelligence stops being something the child does and starts becoming something that they are. This sounds amazing in theory, but if the title of this video is anything to go by, this ease, unfortunately, doesn't last forever. The gifted child becomes the former gifted child, a regular adult, burdened with pressure and struggling with burnout. Why does this happen? If you're a gifted adult, what can you do about it? And if you have gifted kids around you, how can you protect them from this? This is the psychology of the former gifted child. From a cognitive perspective, the human brain is an efficient machine. Its primary function is not truth, growth, or self-actualization, it's energy conservation. The brain constantly seeks the least metabolically expensive way to reach an outcome, in other words, the shortest path between problem and solution. When a child repeatedly succeeds without effort, their brain learns a very simple rule. Effort is unnecessary. This creates an adaptation that tells the brain that if raw intellect alone produces rewards, then hard work is simply metabolic waste. Practice feels wasteful, repetition feels insulting. Why grind when intuition is always faster? Why struggle when understanding comes to you automatically? Over time, the gifted child's brain becomes exceptionally good at bypassing difficulty altogether. It learns how to skip steps. In psychology, skill acquisition depends on gradual exposure to challenge. Most children climb difficulty incrementally. They struggle early, fail often, and slowly build tolerance for confusion, frustration, and sustained effort. They learn how to learn. The gifted child, however, is often exempt from this process. They skip the tutorial. They jump ahead before the foundational habits ever really form. As a result, something critical never develops. Habituated effort. The gifted child does not build study rituals because they don't need them. They don't develop persistence because success arrives without resistance. They don't learn how to sit with not knowing because confusion rarely lasts long enough to test their endurance. From the outside, this looks like exceptional ability. From the inside, it creates a fragile cognitive ecosystem that depends entirely on things remaining easy. And school does nothing to correct this. In fact, it accelerates it. Educational systems are designed in a way where gifted children are rarely challenged appropriately, and when they are bored, that boredom is interpreted as proof of superiority rather than a signal of unmet developmental needs. Over time, the child internalizes a very dangerous lesson that struggle is abnormal. This lesson spreads from their academic life and becomes a part of their identity. Praise plays a central role here as well. When children are praised for effort, they learn that success is something they build. When they are praised for intelligence, they learn that success is something they must protect. "You're so smart," someone saying that, feels encouraging, but psychologically it creates a fixed reference point. Intelligence becomes a trait that must be defended rather than a capacity that can be exercised. The child begins to understand implicitly that being smart means not trying too hard. If something requires visible effort, it threatens that image of intelligence, so they try their best to shy away from effort, from struggle, from failure. Psychologically, this creates what many former gifted children later describe as paralysis. They want to do meaningful things, but only if success is guaranteed. The ego frames every challenge as a coin flip. If I try and fail, I lose my claim to my identity. If I don't try, well, at least the possibility of being exceptional remains intact. This is why a lot of gifted kids struggle with a crippling fear of failure that prevents them from ever trying something they're not 100% sure would work, even though in the real world some sort of risk is almost always required for success. Instead, they stick to the safest option, which is, well, inaction. This avoidance pattern is often misinterpreted as arrogance or entitlement. In reality, it's a defense mechanism. The gifted child is protecting the only version of themselves that has ever been validated. Trying and failing, it doesn't just hurt, it threatens the total of annihilation of their self-concept. And all of this remains totally invisible as long as the environment stays forgiving. But eventually, the child reaches a point where raw intellect is no longer enough. This moment is often described by former gifted adults as hitting the wall. It might happen in higher education, in a demanding career, or simply in adult life where complexity, ambiguity, and long-term effort are totally unavoidable. For the first time, understanding does not come instantly. For the first time, success requires sustained, uncomfortable effort. And the problem isn't that the task is hard. The problem is that the gifted child never learned how to be bad at something and keep going. They never learned the art of getting good. Where others experience a gradual learning curve, the gifted individual experiences a sudden collapse. There's no ramp up, no adjustment period, no tolerance for their own imperfections. The system goes from effortless success to a complete and total breakdown. And because their identity was never built around effort, they have nothing to fall back on. What follows is often interpreted as burnout, laziness, or wasted potential, but psychologically, it is something else entirely. It is the consequence of an efficiency-optimized mind that was never taught how to struggle. One of the saddest realities about becoming a gifted adult is remembering all of your niche interests that you can no longer pursue because you just don't have the time or the energy to fully explore them. Think about it. How many books are on your Kindle list waiting to be read? How many amazing newsletters have you just not had the time to dive into? Well, you no longer have to struggle with any of that, thanks to the sponsor of today's video, Shortform. Shortform makes the best guides to nonfiction books that I've seen. They're like superpowered book summaries, with way more depth and actionable lessons that you can immediately apply into your life. One of my favorite books ever is The Third Door by Alex Banayan. I honestly reread the entire book once a year, but anytime I'm stuck trying to make a big business or life decision, I go on Shortform and I read through the book's guide to help me remember all of the ideas in the book and see how quickly I can apply them to my current situation. Things like finding the best way to get people's attention and how to know when a risk is really worth it. Beyond books, Shortform also has guides on really interesting topics like psychology, money, and technology, all built from multiple different perspectives to really give you a complete understanding. With new book guides and articles every week, there's always something for everyone. In fact, as a subscriber, you get the chance to vote on what book they cover next. To finally start clearing your reading backlog, join Shortform through my link, shortform.com/aperture, or click the first link in the description to receive $50 off the annual plan. Back to our story. If the gifted child's early life is defined by ease, their adulthood is often defined by expectation. From a young age, gifted children are surrounded by a particular narrative. Teachers predict great futures. Parents speak in terms of what they will become. Potential becomes the central theme of their identity long before they even fully understand what any of it means. And potential, unlike ability, does not live in the present. It lives in the future. Psychologically, this creates a subtle but powerful distortion. The gifted child is not evaluated for who they are or what they've built. They're evaluated for what they're supposed to become. Their value is deferred. Their worth exists in a hypothetical version of themselves that has not yet arrived. Think about it like building a mansion. Society hands the gifted child a blueprint for a mansion, and it's not a small one, but a grand one. Something impressive, complex, and rare. Meanwhile, their peers are given blueprints for modest shacks, simple structures, manageable projects, ones that can be completed step by step over time with ordinary effort. The problem is not that the mansion is better. The problem is that building a mansion takes far longer, far more planning, and far more tolerance for unfinished work. As children, this difference doesn't matter. Everyone is still laying foundations. But adulthood changes the timeline. At some point, people begin to compare outcomes rather than plans, and this is where the gifted individual begins to suffer. They look around and see their peers living inside completed structures, careers, families, routines, and stability. Though they may not be glamorous, they are real. They exist. Meanwhile, the gifted adult looks at their own project and sees only an incomplete foundation, half-built walls, abandoned plans, endless revisions. They see a potential that has never been actualized. And psychologically, this feels like failure. Even if the gifted person has worked harder than others, even if they've explored more ideas, taken more risks, or thought more deeply, none of that matters if the structure isn't finished. Potential does not count as shelter. Intention does not count as completion. This creates a unique form of shame. Not the shame of being incapable, but the shame of not living up to what was promised. The gifted adult is haunted not by who they are, but by who they could have been. Every choice feels like a deviation from their larger-than-life potential. Every unfinished project feels like evidence of their ordinariness. Every ordinary outcome feels like a betrayal of the blueprint. In this way, potential becomes a curse rather than a gift. Instead of motivating action, it creates paralysis. The standards are so high, the imagined future so grand that any real-world step feels simply insufficient. Why build something small when you were meant to build something extraordinary after all? Why settle for a shack when you were promised a mansion? This dynamic is intensified by comparison. Gifted individuals are often acutely aware of trajectories. They notice where others are in their lives. They measure themselves against their peers, not in terms of happiness or meaning, but in terms of progress towards some imagined ideal. And because their ideal is larger and more abstract, it is always further away. The result is a constant sense of being behind, even when objectively, they're not. Psychologically, this produces what can be described as temporal shame. Shame not about the present moment, but about time itself. Years feel wasted, decisions feel irreversible, the future feels like it's closing in rather than opening up. And because this shame is tied to identity and not behavior, it becomes very difficult to address. You can fix a mistake, you can change a habit, but how? How do you escape a version of yourself that exists only in your own imagination? Many former gifted children respond to this by disengaging entirely. Well, if that mansion can never be properly built, why try to build it at all? Others cling to potential as a form of psychological comfort. As long as the mansion remains hypothetical, it can't be judged. The dream stays intact as long as it is never tested against reality. This leads to a strange inversion. Actual achievement becomes threatening because it collapses the fantasy into something finite. To complete something is to admit it is smaller than what was imagined, and so the gifted adult oscillates between grand visions and complete inaction, trapped between ego and fear. At the same time, there's another layer to this psychology that often goes unnoticed. Giftedness is rarely evenly distributed across development. High intellectual ability frequently comes with asynchronous growth. A child may be cognitively advanced, but emotionally underdeveloped. They may understand complex concepts long before they can regulate their emotional feelings. They may think abstractly while still responding to the world with the emotional sensitivity of a much younger child. This mismatch creates internal chaos. Because the child appears mature intellectually, their emotional needs are often overlooked. Adults assume capability in one domain implies capability in all others, but it doesn't. Emotional regulation, frustration tolerance, and social resilience develop through experience, not intelligence. And when those experiences are avoided or misunderstood, development stalls. Many gifted children learn to intellectualize their emotions instead of feeling them. They develop what psychologists call cognitive empathy. They can analyze emotions, explain them, predict them, and even perform the correct response. But they do not fully inhabit the emotional experience itself. They become observers of their own feelings rather than participants in them. This can look like maturity, but internally it often leads to emotional isolation. Feelings are treated as problems to solve rather than experiences to live through. Compounding this is the reality that giftedness often involves heightened sensitivity. Many gifted individuals experience what psychologists describe as overexcitabilities, increased intensity across intellectual, emotional, sensory, psychomotor, or creative domains. This can manifest as deep curiosity, but also as anxiety, sensory overwhelm, existential dread, or emotional reactivity at a young age. In standard educational environment, these traits are rarely accommodated. Boredom is punished, sensitivity is misunderstood, intensity is pathologized. As a result, many gifted children learn to suppress or mask parts of themselves in order to function normally. This is why some experts argue that gifted children are, in effect, special needs students, not because they're deficient, but because they do not thrive in systems designed for average cognitive and emotional profiles. Without proper support, their development becomes uneven and fragile. By adulthood, all of these factors converge: a fragile identity built on intelligence, a paralyzing burden of potential, emotional development that lagged behind cognitive ability, and a deep, unspoken sense of shame about time, progress, and unrealized futures. By adulthood, many former gifted children begin to notice something unsettling. They're alone. Not necessarily physically isolated, but socially disconnected in a way that feels difficult to articulate. Conversations feel shallow. Relationships feel unsatisfying. There's a persistent sense of being out of sync with the people around them, as though everyone else is operating on a different frequency. And at first, this disconnection is confusing, and then it becomes painful, and eventually, for many, it becomes defended. Psychologically, when belonging is threatened, the mind looks for ways to restore stability. If connection feels unavailable, meaning must be preserved somewhere else. For the former gifted child, that meaning often collapses back into the only identity that ever worked: intelligence. This is where defensive arrogance emerges. Defensive arrogance is not the belief that one is better than others. It is the belief that others are incapable of understanding you. It is a way of reframing loneliness as superiority. If no one understands you, it must be because you are too deep, too complex, too intelligent for them. This narrative is comforting because it preserves self-worth and doesn't require them to be vulnerable with their own feelings and inadequacies. Rather than confronting the pain of not fitting in, the mind reframes disconnection as distinction. When you ask, "Why can't I connect?" it answers, "Because they can't keep up." Over time, this story becomes self-sealing. Any failed interaction reinforces the belief. The tragedy is that this belief system feels rational. Gifted individuals often do think differently. They may enjoy abstraction, nuance, or complexity in ways that maybe others don't. But the leap from different to above is where isolation hardens into identity. At that point, intelligence is no longer a bridge, it becomes a hard brick wall. This dynamic also explains why some gifted adults gravitate towards social environments where they feel intellectually dominant. Surrounding oneself with people perceived as less intelligent offers a sense of safety. There's no risk of exposure, no threat to the ego, there's no chance of being outpaced. This is sometimes described as the midwit problem. The gifted individual avoids peers who might challenge them, not consciously, but emotionally. They prefer environments where they can maintain their self-concept without any friction. But the cost of this safety is stagnation. Growth requires being challenged. Connection requires equality, and neither can exist when superiority is a non-negotiable. As a result, the gifted adult lives inside a closed psychological loop. They feel disconnected. They explain the disconnection through superiority. They choose environments that reinforce that belief. Those environments limit growth and intimacy, which deepens the disconnection, and all around it goes. This loop is reinforced by another pattern: intellectualization. Gifted individuals are exceptionally good at thinking about things. This includes thinking about social situations, emotions, and even personal change. The problem is that thinking becomes a substitute for doing. The mind simulates experiences rather than engaging in them. Rather than going to a party, the gifted adult imagines it. They predict the conversations, the boredom, the superficiality, and so they decide that it's not worth it and stay home. Rather than starting a project, they mentally map out the obstacles and decide that it's too risky and not worth the effort. Rather than trying something unfamiliar, they analyze it to the point of certainty that it will fail. And because the simulation feels detailed, it feels real, it feels logically sound, and it feels correct. Psychologically, the brain does not distinguish between imagined and lived experience when emotional prediction is involved. So the gifted adult comes to believe they already know how things will turn out. The world becomes predictable, dull, and unworthy of engagement, not because it actually is, but because it has never been properly encountered, and this keeps them trapped in this abstraction. Life becomes something to be understood rather than lived and experienced, and experience itself becomes optional. Actions become unnecessary because change only occurs through experience, not insight, so nothing actually changes. This is why it's so difficult to advise a gifted adult. They'll dissect everything you say, analyze the edge cases, point out expectations, and convince themselves that they are in fact a special case, that their situation is more complex, more nuanced, more unique than whatever framework that you're suggesting. In reality, their intellect is working on behalf of the ego. Rather than being used to grow, intellect is used to defend. It finds reasons not to try. It finds flaws in every suggestion. It reframes inaction as discernment. And because the argument sounds intelligent, they are difficult to challenge. This is known as the help-rejecting pattern. The gifted adult understands the advice. They may even agree with it in principle, but they never apply it. Application would require stepping into uncertainty, risking failure, and dismantling the identity that says that they are already above such basic solutions. And so they remain stuck, aware enough to see the problem, intelligent enough to explain it, but emotionally unable to move through it. Over time, this creates a particular kind of exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of effort, but the exhaustion of potential energy. So much thought, so little motion. So many internal models, so little reality. Life begins to feel unreal, stalled, as though it's happening somewhere else. And yet, despite all of this, the situation isn't hopeless. The very mechanisms that keep gifted individuals trapped also contain the seeds of their release. The same intelligence that defends the ego can be redirected. The same awareness that fuels rumination can be used for dismantling identity. But doing so requires something counterintuitive. It requires letting go of being special. You may wonder how I know so much about the reality of a gifted kid. Well, it's because, you might have predicted this already, I was one. I was made to skip grades because I was ahead of all my peers. I taken college philosophy classes while in high school, getting top of the class with very little effort. The whole shebang. But you may have noticed throughout this entire video, I never spoke in the first person. I didn't say I or we. And that's because the only way to heal from the struggles of being a former gifted kid is to let go of that identity. You need to let go of that story that you have always been told and that you have been telling yourself. The story that once explained everything, that once protected you and allowed you to make sense of your difference, your boredom, your isolation, and unrealized potential. The story of being gifted. This identity often survives far longer than it should. Even after academic success fades, even after life becomes complicated, even after comparison turns painful, the label remains. It lingers in the background as a quiet justification of everything. I could have been something extraordinary. Well, that identity is a trap because it is built on conditional worth. It says, you matter if you become what you were supposed to be. Your value is deferred to a future version of yourself, and until that version exists, you are incomplete. Healing requires dismantling this identity entirely. Psychologically, this feels like grief, and like all grief, it comes with denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and eventually acceptance. The denial often looks like endless self-analysis. The anger looks like resentment towards systems, parents, teachers, or society. The bargaining looks like waiting for the perfect project, the perfect moment, the perfect plan. The depression looks like paralysis. Acceptance looks like something far quieter. It is admitting that in many domains you are average, that your intelligence does not exempt you from effort, that you are not special in the ways that you were told and you once believed. And for someone whose entire self-concept was built around being exceptional, this feels like annihilation. Trust me, I went through it. But I can assure you that it isn't. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's liberation. The gifted identity collapses because it was never meant to be permanent. It was a childhood adaptation, not a lifelong blueprint. It helped the child survive environments that didn't meet their needs. It gave them meaning when effort wasn't required. But adulthood demands something else of us entirely. It demands being human before being impressive. One of the most difficult steps in this process is accepting what many gifted adults privately fear most: being stupid in certain areas, struggling socially, failing emotionally, being inconsistent, being slow, making ordinary mistakes, doing things badly for a long time. Although these things often feel like regression, they're really not. They're just development finally catching up with us. The gifted child skipped critical developmental stages. Healing requires going back and building up those foundations. Study habits, emotional regulation, tolerance for frustration, the ability to fail without self-erasure. These are not glamorous skills. They do not feel intellectual. And that is precisely why they were avoided. Letting go of the gifted identity also means challenging the belief that effort is beneath you. Many gifted adults intellectually agree that effort matters, but emotionally they resist it. Effort feels humiliating. It feels like proof that the myth wasn't true. The moment you stop trying to preserve an image of intelligence, well, effort becomes more neutral. It's no longer a referendum on who you are as a person. It is simply the cost of doing anything meaningful. This shift is captured well by an ancient idea from the Bhagavad Gita: karma versus phala. You are entitled to the action, not the outcome. To the work, not the reward. To the process, not the praise. From being conditioned to tie your worth to outcomes like grades, recognition, achievement, the Gita's framing breaks that link. You show up because showing up is the point. You write because writing is the only way to become a great writer. You try because trying is what humans do. When outcome is removed from identity, perfectionism loses its grip. This also means confronting the special case narrative, the belief that standard advice doesn't apply to you, that your situation is uniquely complex, that boring solutions won't work. This belief is comforting, absolutely, because it preserves uniqueness, but it is also a form of avoidance. The laws of effort apply to everyone. No amount of intelligence exempts you from practice. No amount of insight replaces experience. No amount of theory substitutes for repetition. And the moment you accept this, the world becomes simpler. Not easier, but clearer. Another critical step is lowering your expectations. And hey, this does not mean abandoning your ambition. It means releasing the imagined mansion, letting go of the future self that was never real, accepting the current reality as the starting point rather than a disappointment. Lowering expectations closes the shame gap. When you stop measuring yourself against an impossible ideal, the present becomes tolerable. Action becomes possible. Small progress stops feeling insulting, and ironically, this is when real growth begins. Many gifted adults discover that once the pressure to be exceptional dissolves, energy returns, creativity resurfaces, curiosity becomes playful rather than compulsive, and life regains texture. But there is one final metaphor that captures this entire psychological journey. The gifted brain is like a Ferrari. Incredible engine, exceptional horsepower, designed for speed and complexity. But if you never learn how to drive it, if you never develop emotional regulation, discipline, and patience, then it doesn't matter how powerful the engine is, you're going to drive that car into a wall. And if you place that Ferrari in traffic, in a system designed for average speeds, well, it's going to overheat, it stalls, it breaks down. Meanwhile, that junky old Toyota Camry is just driving right past you with no difficulty. And not because they're a superior machine, but because they are built for the environment. They're reliable, they move consistently, they don't depend on ideal conditions to function. Healing isn't about becoming faster, it's about learning how to drive your Ferrari and finally building a highway where you can thrive. The tragedy of the gifted child is not that they fail to become extraordinary. It's that they are never taught on how to become ordinary. Ordinary in the psychological sense does not mean mediocre. It means embodied. It means capable of effort, failure, repair, and continuation. It means having a self that can survive contact with reality without shattering. The gifted child was rewarded for bypassing reality, for skipping steps, for solving problems without engaging the process, and for a while, sure, it worked. But adulthood does not reward shortcuts. It rewards consistency. It rewards resilience. It rewards people who know how to keep going when nothing feels impressive. By the time the former gifted child realizes this, they are often already exhausted, not from effort, but from avoidance. Not from trying too hard, but from never learning how to try at all. And this is why the crash feels so disorienting. They don't fail gradually. They stall. Life for them stops moving forward. Life passes, but nothing changes. And because their identity was built on potential rather than process, they have no framework for rebuilding. What makes this especially painful is that the gifted individual can usually explain what's wrong. They understand the patterns. They can articulate the psychology. They can even diagnose themselves. But insight alone does not create motion. And motion is the only thing that heals. Healing begins when intelligence stops being the center of gravity, not when it disappears, but when it becomes just one trait among many, when it no longer defines worth. This requires a fundamental shift in how the self is organized. The gifted identity says, I am valuable if I'm exceptional. The grounded identity says, I'm valuable because I'm engaged. Engagement replaces performance. Presence replaces promise. Process replaces potential. At this point, the efficiency trap dissolves. The brain no longer seeks the cheapest path to validation because validation is no longer the goal. The goal becomes participation, showing up, doing the work, being in the world. Effort stops feeling like evidence of inadequacy and starts feeling like proof of life. The mansion blueprint fades into irrelevance. There is no grand future self awaiting to arrive. There's only what you build today with the tools you have in the conditions that exist. And it turns out that's enough. Socially, this shift changes everything. When you no longer need to be superior, connection becomes possible. Conversations stop being evaluations. Relationships stop being a means to stroke your ego. You no longer need to be understood as exceptional to feel seen. You can meet people where they are, not above them. Defensive arrogance dissolves because it's no longer needed. The world stops being full of people who just don't get it and becomes full of people who are simply human, different, flawed, and also complex in their own unique ways. The help rejection cycle breaks because advice is no longer a threat. You don't need solutions to preserve your identity. You need them to live. And suddenly, boring advice works. Do the work. Start small. Be consistent. Fail publicly. Try again. Not because you're special, because you are human. This is also where emotional development catches up. Feelings are no longer problems to solve or narratives to analyze. They are experiences to tolerate. You learn to sit with discomfort without intellectualizing it away. You learn to stay present when things are messy, uncertain, or slow. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, life begins to move again for you. Not dramatically, not heroically, but steadily. You learn how to drive your Ferrari. A final irony, I think, is this. Many former gifted children do eventually become extraordinary, but not in the way they imagined. Not as prodigies or untouchable minds, but as people who understand struggle, humility, and process deeply. They become extraordinary because they know what it means to rebuild a self from the ground up, and that knowledge cannot be gifted. It has to be earned. The psychology of the gifted child is not a story about wasted potential, it is a story about misdirected development, a system that confused intelligence with identity, ease with ability, and promise with worth. Healing is not about reclaiming the gift, it is about letting it go. When you stop trying to be gifted, you finally get to just be.